I am Dorothée Imbert, I'm the director of the Knowlton School, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 edition of ARTA Presentations. For more than a decade, the Knowlton School has partnered with the Columbus Foundation to fund independent research travel for Knowlton students through the Architecture Research Travel Award program known as ARTA. So the title spells architecture, but ARTA awards are available to all of you, whether you're an undergrad or a graduate student in architecture, landscape architecture, or city and regional planning. I want to take a moment to thank Vanessa Carey and the Columbus Foundation for its generous support of the ARTA program. Vanessa is here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is a fantastic program which allows us to send, willing and able and enthusiastic students across the United States and abroad to carry their independent research. So this is a great program, and I really encourage you to take part in it. Since the program's inception, ARTA has funded approximately 60 students to travel from, and I'm just going to name a few, from Brazil to Kenya and Iceland to Cambodia and all across the United States. So it supports independent travel and research initiatives for up to 30 days. The deadline to apply for this next round is for summer 2023 is Friday, January 27, 2023. More details about the program can be found on the Knowlton website, and we will be sending out emails, so please open those emails. This is really worth it. As part of the process, grantees are asked to present a summary of their research, which is what is happening today. This summer 2022 ARTA Award winners who are presented today are, and then please drum roll, Trecia Cintron, BSLA, yay, for her Environmental Justice Atlas, which mapped hazardous sites and their impact on Black and Hispanic communities across the Midwest. Then we will have Annie Purcell, MLA, Catching the Drift, Geological Interpretation through Transects. I think we should give prizes also to titles, the longest, the smartest, the funniest. That would be great. So Annie's research how people can orient themselves in what is called the driftless regions, an area that covers parts of Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois. Gillian Marquardt, BSLA, on the, thank you, Olmsted Intentions versus Time, which focuses on New York famous Central Park. And then ending with Rachel Schmitmeyer, MArch, on the power and memory of architecture, thank you, through Boston, New Orleans, and Santa Fe by exploring the topics of colonization, slavery, and the revolution. So without further ado, again, thank you to the Columbus Foundation. Many, many thanks also to Doug Sershen for filling in for our audio, and Casey Becker for the installation. Please welcome Trecia Cintron.
So my work this summer focused on visiting communities of color situated next to big urban polluters and contaminated sites within the Twin Cities, so Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, and St. Louis, Missouri. It was a long trip around each city, and I often slept at rest stops and camped out in Planet Fitnesses to escape the heat wave, and I had a lot of friends in each city that also helped give me research leads. So it was an interesting trip, and I can't believe I actually drove 1,800 miles still. So that is a time. So I chose these cities because they're highly urban areas along the Mississippi watershed with predominant communities of color. So my work is largely organized along waterways because I'm also interested in learning how the passage of toxic contaminants and sediment has downstream impacts on the lower Mississippi watershed. So I'm basically studying the movement and chemical properties of water that passes through contaminated sites and moving along their drainage path into their watershed. In later phases of this project, I plan to loop in the Ohio River tributary and connect that to my case study cities, and then loop that back to my hometown, which is in northern Ohio. It's Elyria and Lorain, because I do have personal experience with a lot of the experiences of environmental justice that I'm researching today. So when I mentioned Midwestern industrialism, I just want to clarify that I have been looking at Superfund sites, manufacturing, factories, oil pipelines, and also included but not limited to landfills, brownfields, industrial plants, etc., all the above. And additionally, for those unaware of what a Superfund is, it's a contaminated site with hazardous waste that has a long-term remediation plan and sometimes gets caught up in bureaucratic paperwork, but it eventually gets cleaned up and remediated is the long-term goal. But when I look at the word industry and industrialism, it defines as systemic labor with an operational process. So there are many industries that exist to work against the livelihood of BIPOC communities in the United States. Thinking back to Black Lives Matter and the protests of 2020, sparked by George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the industry of policing became a more mainstream thought for many of us back then, but it's always been a thought for people that look like me, but also my family members as well. It's always been a thought that's triggered fight or flight, or brought up grief connected to like an unfortunate encounter because we've known someone who's been in a situation like that. Police brutality is also something of an industry itself. Black neighborhoods are heavily policed. Black Americans are more likely to receive prison sentences and more severe consequences for nonviolent offenses, and to end up in prisons also where they're further exposed to more toxic harm and inhumane conditions than they had previously been in. So the physical and political environment of these communities reinforces the prison industrial complex. And sometimes also in Black neighborhoods, that residence is built on top of a Superfund. It's built on top of a contaminated site, and there isn't any acknowledgement of that. Referencing Gordon Plaza in New Orleans, which is a prime example of this, or harmful polluters are placed in these communities and adjacent to them. So there's just more and more barriers that are making life harder and more dangerous for people of color in America. And either way, it's become an industrial process on how strategically municipalities disarm a community and promote environmental incarceration. So it's already hard enough to economically advance as people of color that earn less than white counterparts in the same position, oftentimes, which leaves people to stay in places and grow their families that are forcibly exposed and designed to have a premature death living in situations like this, triggered by toxic pollutants in and around places that we call home. So today I'll dive a little bit deeper into Minneapolis, into the East Phillips neighborhood, and I'll also be talking about St. Louis in Missouri. So East Phillips is in the southeast corner of Minneapolis, and it's located in an area that's infamously known as the Arsenic Triangle. There was a pesticide manufacturing company that used to live on the Roof Depot spot, which is marked in red there. And decades ago, there was some toxic waste left behind in the form of an arsenic plume underneath that Roof Depot site. This area is also a Superfund, and it is on the national priorities list as of 2007, so a little less than 15 years ago. The community formed a coalition called the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute, otherwise known as EPNI, and they used their presence to advocate for that parcel of land to be an urban farm complex, where businesses affected by the 2020 protests in Minneapolis can have a home, and where East Phillips residents can grow food for themselves and provide jobs for its residents as well. So this sounds like an amazing idea, right? To funnel back some positivity and some stimulus into the East Phillips neighborhood and community. But the city has plans to place a public works motor pool area and facility on top of this Roof Depot site. And that's the same site that EPNI has been eyeing for this project, hence the dilemma. So the city claimed this parcel by eminent domain and have relentlessly pushed forward with their project that doesn't really speak to any environmental assessment or remediation of that arsenic plume underneath the site. And also it doesn't really speak to how much diesel emission will be coming from increased truck traffic into this neighborhood that's already experiencing severe amounts of air pollution and experiencing impacts of that on their public health. So these are two of the big polluters already in the area. On the left there is the Smith Foundry, and on the right there is Bituminous Roadways. It's an asphalt company. They're both directly across from the Roof Depot, and there's already high concentrations of contaminants in the air, and even in the groundwater and soil below too. There's unknown variables because they've spread so far and wide throughout this community. And there also have unfortunately been deaths linked to the poor environmental quality as well. So Kids at Little Earth. Little Earth is the indigenous housing complex that's in East Phillips. They're experiencing their highest rates of asthma that they've ever seen. More residents are developing asthma, heart issues, diabetes, the list goes on, just from exposure to this site and being within that 2-mile radius. And so in communities of color like East Phillips, people are dying because of environmental toxins. They were people without any prior family history of asthma or heart issues. These things are just popping up seemingly, and it's not coincidental anymore. People cannot breathe. And the last words of George Floyd were, "I can't breathe." And it's devastating to hear that again 2 years later in the same area that George Floyd was murdered in. And it's sad that so many Black Americans are also saying the same sentiment, and it makes me wonder when breathing clean air became a privilege as opposed to a human right. On another note, these are some of the signs that I found on site in June. They were taken down, but EPNI has put some back up, which is great. So I got to witness the passion of EPNI because I attended a community meeting hosted by Councilman Jason Chavez in Minneapolis at the time. It happened to perfectly line up with my trip. And we were there to discuss the Public Works project. And EPNI showed up. There was some heated discussion to be had about this. And so I got to introduce myself as well. I connected with a lot of the residents there. I learned more about their stories. We exchanged contact info. And I'm actually still involved with them post ARTA as well. I'm helping with communications on that on the nonprofit side. So that has been a great time, but that was quite the meeting. But I really witnessed how crass the mayor's office was with notifying EPNI on developments of this project and negotiating for a decision on an item without having all the requested information that they need to make an informed decision about the future of their lives, the future of their kids' lives. So there's a lot of pent-up frustration with this research and with this project, but I have like little tiny additional highlights of Minneapolis too, because I also did some self-care. I got to see some friends while on my trip. That first one is a blueberry pie that my friend Ella made me. It was the best blueberry pie I've ever had. That middle one was a book I was reading. Granted, maybe it was really relevant to my research. It was called How to Kill a City, and it talks about gentrification and inequality in neighborhoods. Very insightful read, I recommend. And then also some mint tea that my friend Ella made me to help me calm down after going to a community meeting like this or just walking around the neighborhood in like a heat wave. So all in all, a good trip. This is an image of the urban farm concept idea that EPNI proposed for their project. So this is 3 acres of the site. It's on that corner of Longfellow on the Roof Depot site. It's a really beautiful concept, and it has potential to be a thriving community hub for East Phillips. And I think it could be even like a national precedent for other community organizations as well. But that's if this goes forward, hopefully. The president of EPNI is also actually an architect, so his firm worked on this concept, which I thought was really cool that he was able to plug in his skills to his nonprofit work, and they rendered this for the meeting with the city. Additionally, I wanted to also have some excerpts of narratives from the community members, and so I'm a part of that EPNI comms team, and so I wasn't able to have this interview with this resident, but Cassie Holmes is a resident of Little Earth, that indigenous housing complex that I was talking about, and she has had quite the experience with environmental racism in East Phillips. And so I have like 2 quotes that I'm gonna like go through on this slide while I tell you kind of about her story and her experience with this. So, let's see. So Cassie lost her son in 2013. He experienced severe heart issues. He was diagnosed with a heart disease at age 14 and went through 2 years of extensive heart surgeries to fix complications, but ultimately passed away at age 16. And he was a really active member in the community. He was really active physically. Their family had no prior history of heart issues. And they also had no idea at the time what was living around them or living so close to their home. Unfortunately, also later on, another person in the community had also passed away from heart issues, a 21-year-old female who just gave birth. She fell very ill, went to the hospital, They thought it was acid reflux. She kind of had a feeling that it might have been something more. They sent her home. Eventually she did go back and did not go home because she passed away from heart complications. And no one knew how sick they were actually until it was too late. And it just wasn't coincidental anymore because more cases of disease popped up over the next few years after that. And this quote is also talking about the opioid pandemic in East Phillips as well. It's a neighborhood that has definitely been through a lot. Switching over to St. Louis though, due to the fact that I did visit 3 big cities and I also had to move cross country after my ARTA trip and to start a new position. I'm still kind of processing St. Louis, but I do want to make note of how climate disasters and flood events worsen the situation of contaminants in the environment, because this is something that I hadn't really thought of prior to reading a news article from a state rep in Missouri. So this building, the Met Center, it used to be a place called Wagner Electric, a problematic company that proposed putting a landfill in the middle of a black community in the 50s, and also suggested putting one a block away from an elementary school. They ended up improperly disposing of their waste, which consisted of PCBs, which is a highly carcinogenic chemical compound. And no one knew where they improperly disposed of this waste up until 2008, when there was a flood, a really horrific flood that passed through St. Louis. And it turns out those PCBs were actually in the structure itself and also in the parking lot. So those floodwaters passed through there carrying those PCBs, and it also picked up 2 black residents along the way as well. They unfortunately were discovered miles away from the site, and they passed away. But those floodwaters also carry those PCBs out into the watershed, and that will further impact things downstream as well. But this was a building that was also actively used, and since 2008, a number of employees have passed away from similar illnesses, and it's all tying back to this 2008 flood when there were employees at the time there. So climate disasters like this disproportionately affect people of color. Huge flood events displace these communities and create high exposure events, not only in St. Louis, but also in places like New Orleans, where most predominantly black communities live in the lowest topographic areas of the city, and thus more prone to disastrous impacts of climate change. So while in St. Louis, I was able to stay with my former KSA mentor, Paul McGinnity, in the community design studio Arbelope. Very thankful for them. They had a place for me to work throughout the week where I could just come and debrief or talk with them. They connect with people in St. Louis. I loved it. And I was able to tag along on their Peace Park project, which this is a picture from that site meeting. And I even got to present some of my findings to them so far on my ARTA trip while still being on it, and talk about my LAF work. And I really appreciated that support network and connection to the faculty at WashU as well. It really helped me expand my network, and it revealed sites to me that I had not considered until I had gone there. I was looking at the Westlake landfill in St. Louis County, and that is kind of on the outskirts in Bridgeton, Missouri, in St. Louis County. And there's an underground incinerator there that is blasting an area of the site that has Manhattan Project radioactive waste dumpings, which is highly problematic, and there's a lot of organizing around that effort as well. I just noticed that the demographics weren't aligning with my research focus, and so I came to the city confused, but I left with a lot more information and connections than I originally had come in with. And so I was kind of pointed to East St. Louis, which is something that I'm going to check out for the future. And then I also wanted to talk about the future of this work. I'll kind of breeze through this a little fast. I have a game plan with kind of how I want this work to proceed. Essentially, I want to have a digital presence and also recruit team members for this, because I feel like we need people from a lot of different perspectives, and interdisciplinary work is ultimately what's going to help push this through and connect with a lot of different people all over. I'm also want to collaborate and partner with relevant nonprofits as well in the Midwest, so such as some of those listed there. And I want to continue fieldwork and getting more involved with organizing with each organization. I want to go back and visit people and actually talk with people more, because I feel like a lot of environmental justice research is very quantitative, and it doesn't have that qualitative interview narrative piece to that. So that's kind of where I'm fitting into the puzzle. And so with that being said, thank you for being here for me and my work. I've listed my contact info there, Trecia Cintron at usda.gov, and my phone number is there as well, text or email. And if you'd like to reach out to learn more about my work, if you want to learn more about the ARTA process, if you want to maybe loop in somehow, I have had people reach out already. So definitely reach out to me. Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Annie Purcell, and I'm a third-year master's student in the Landscape Architecture program. I'd like to thank the Columbus Foundation for the opportunity to travel this summer, and I'd also like to thank the Knowlton faculty and my classmates for your continuous support. I'd also like to give thanks to my research assistant on this project, Kristen Roach, a land use planner working in Chicago, and a friend whose wisdom and curiosity aided me in pursuing the questions asked about vibrant matter. This summer I used the ARTA to travel to the Driftless, a 25,000 square mile region covering northeast Iowa, southeast Minnesota, southwest Wisconsin, and a small portion of southwest Illinois. Known for its anomalous topography, the Driftless is named for its lack of glacier debris, or drift. All of the terrain surrounding the region has been at one time covered by glaciers, shaped by eons of ice pushing and flattening and grinding into the topography. The Driftless was spared, avoided by the last 4 glacial events, and consequently sits like an ancient island surrounded by a much younger landscape. As many of you may know, Ohio is similarly divided by this glacial activity. The northern 2/3 of our state have been scraped flat by the Laurentine ice sheet during the Wisconsin glacial phase tens of thousands of years ago. This explains how we can have flat cornfields here in the north and then transition to rolling hills in the south. It was this contrast that initially got me interested in glaciated and unglaciated landscapes, and I've remained curious about the ancient regrading that has occurred to form the landscapes we see today. It's within geology that we may begin to understand and experience scales otherwise incomprehensible to us mere humans. Scales of size, like the massive ice slabs that once covered everything above the surface, or the bedrock that makes up everything below, but also scales of time. Of the 4.5 billion years the Earth has been around, we've only existed for 200,000 of them. Despite what we may think we may know, our perspective is greatly outshined by rocks. It is our inability to grasp these magnitudes that can make it difficult to understand planet-wide occurrences, planet-wide harm, and a change of a planet-wide climate. Today, I suggest that a dialogue with the geological, or at least a recognition of its vitality, can help us begin to conceive of issues, problems, and solutions that are outside of our own perceptive magnitude. As landscape architects, we are agents of geomorphology, and it is worth considering what it means to move a contour line on paper. It is with this geologic perception that I approach the Driftless region. As with any good research, I stand on the shoulders of giants. My thinking on geological significance was inspired by Elizabeth Ellsworth and Jamie Cruz of Smudge Studio, and by the political theorist and philosopher Jane Bennett. Ellsworth and Cruz have compiled a dossier of geologic reflection in the form of their book, Making the Geological Now, in which they argue for the acknowledgement of the roles and the powers that the geological plays in contemporary culture. Covering a wide range of topics, including mines, land art, river deltas, and radiation, they reference Bennett and her ideas of vibrant matter, or the activity and autonomy of non-living material. Bennett proposes a philosophy that foregrounds the autonomy of the non-living, or what she calls thing power. To view the world as a vital materialist is to acknowledge that matter has agency beyond automatic or mechanical, and that stuff, things, or in this case rocks, are vital players in the world. It was through this thing power lens that I decided to investigate the Driftless in search of the answers to my questions. What is the relationship between humans and the geological? How can we better understand the non-living? And how can this recognition allow us to make wiser interventions in the world? In planning sites to visit this trip, consideration was given to places that display human-scale geology, since making matter vibrant also means assessing humans as vibrant materials. We visited a number of sites around this tri-state area, including caves and sinkholes in Minnesota and houses built on rocks in Wisconsin. But today what I really want to focus on was our time in northeast Iowa in a place called Bixby State Preserve. Here, topographic conditions create the rare ecological community known as an algific talus slope, a combination of steep, north-facing slopes with fractured limestone bedrock as a foundation offer habitat to rare plants and animals and create an unusual condition. Water enters through the top of the slope in cracks and freezes over the winter. Then, as weather warms and the ice begins to melt, the cooler air inside begins to sink and exit through cracks and holes in the base of the slope. The result is this cold air that blows out of the openings. These ecologies are so rare and fragile that the other only locations of them are kept undisclosed. So on the left is the largest opening of the slope, and because of its rarity, it's guarded with this iron gate. And it was pretty humid the day we visited, and on the right you can see the steam that was coming out of the ice cave. In the center, just inside the cave opening, are visible icicles and more frozen water on the ground. The result is palpable. We visited on a day in the 80s, and the air that was blowing out of the ice cave was nearly down to freezing. We took advantage of the steady cool temperature, and it seemed like other animals did too. The grasses in front of some of the other holes we had found had been matted down as if someone took a rest. The area's plant life resembled an ecosystem found much further north, with many ferns, mosses, lichen, and birch trees. During this leg of our journey, we were joined by Knowlton alum Ryan Vorndran, and he gets credit for finding the inflow vents at the top of the slope. We also found shells from the Pleistocene snail, which is an endangered and relic species from the glaciers that is only found in algific talus slopes in the driftless. We also got to see where the freezing cold water pours out of a hole in the ground near the base of the slope. What we found to be so striking about the area was that the entire time you're inside of the preserve, you're surrounded by these steep rock walls and walking through these rocky passages, but the second the topography gets even the slightest bit flat, a farm field appears. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the Land Ordinance of 1785, he cast a 1 mile by 1 mile grid across much of the Midwest, and we live with those results today. But in the driftless, where dramatic topography makes growing crops on a large scale difficult to impossible, the grid is powerless. Here, the rocks resisted. The geology is an actant rather than an impassive variable. As the Russian geochemist Vladimir Ivanovich Radetzky put it, we are walking, talking minerals. From the calcium of our teeth, to the iron of our blood, to the salt in our sweat and our tears, rocks are our relatives and are more comparable to us than we may initially think. Interpreting the driftless through this object-oriented ontology allows us to position topography as an actor that can and does impose a will. It is this reason that I stand here today in this hall dedicated to the built environment. I propose the humble highway road cut as the site of facilitation between ourselves and the geological. With road cuts to reduce length and grade over the course of a road, soil and rock is removed from the relative rise along a route. The result is not only a reminder of the immovable power of the geological, it's also a gift to us at the human scale. I hope that the next time you're walking by one of these exposed sections, you might consider what the rock you see has lived through. The rock in this photo is a basalt strata that we saw in Wisconsin, aged at nearly 600 million years, meaning it has existed before the Cambrian explosion. It's been around to watch all animal life grow and evolve and flourish, and it will most likely be around for what happens next. This is a scale of time that we have no access to, except in the examples as ordinary and simple as the highway transect. Like long section elevation drawings, Road cuts are one-to-one scale models that allow us to see the stratigraphy of the Earth's crust, a compromise between human desire and geologic autonomy. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. My name is Gillian. I first want to thank you guys all for coming and listening to us, and a special thank you to the Columbus Foundation for supporting this trip. Also, I'm a fourth year in landscape architecture. So, I just want to preface and say this was my first trip traveling by myself, and I was very thankful to take this trip. It really grew my confidence and positively shaped my view on traveling overall. This is me waiting for the plane to take off, and a little luggage tag my Nana gave me before I left that I thought was very fitting. So a quick summary of what I plan to do is I wanted to travel to New York this August to see Central Park. I wanted to analyze the idea of what makes a lasting landscape design. This is one of the first projects we learn about in school, and it is so pivotal to New York City, and it is Olmsted's 200th birthday this year. So I thought it would be a nice way to wish him happy birthday. Before we acknowledge Central Park, I want to acknowledge what was there before Central Park. In the 1850s, this land was the site of Seneca Village. This was a community of predominantly African American individuals that was established with homes, churches, burial grounds, and a school. New York State's abolition of slavery did not end prejudice in the city, and Seneca provided a refuge from this discrimination in the brutal cityscape. Due to residency and property ownership laws in New York City at the time, you had to jump through a lot of loopholes to vote, especially as an African American individual in New York City. And 10 out of 100 Black New Yorkers eligible to vote lived in Seneca Village at the time. With this in mind, moving forward in the 1850s, the mayor was looking around and really wanted a park from Manhattan. They looked at this rocky swampland with Seneca Village on it and appraised it for about $5 million, which is about $174 million today. It was acquired through eminent domain, and many argued that their land was undervalued. Once this land was acquired, Frederick Law Olmsted and engineer Albert Weil were set to design the park, but architect Calvert Vaux was not satisfied with this. His client was one of the park commissioners, and he convinced his client to have the board reject Weil's plan and have a design competition instead. Which takes us to the Greensward plan. And this was a plan designed by Olmsted and Vaux that won the competition. They wanted to simulate a rural, untouched landscape and escape the city that was very brutal at the time. Olmsted and Vaux won this and were appointed as landscape architects, and then construction began. We can see some early sketches here of the Bethesda Terrace, and when the park first opened, it had ice skating that was used on one of the existing lakes. And I want you all to bear with me, there's a lot of history with Central Park, so I tried to condense it as much as I could with what I thought was very pivotal to this, but there's just so much, so we could be here all day. In the 1860s, the Civil War caused a slow to construction, and Olmsted and Vaux resigned. Construction slowly continues, but visitation is booming at the time. After the war ends in 1865, Olmsted and Vaux are reappointed. In the 1870s, the New York City government transformed from a state to city legislature, causing a lot of instability in the Parks Commission. As the board keeps reshaping, goals for the park shift back and forth between amusement and the original design. Olmsted and Vaux are dismissed and rehired multiple times, so construction is slowed between this, lack of funds, and economic panic. In the 1880s, Vaux and his mentee, Samuel Parsons, you can see on the left, managed the park until Vaux's death, and then Samuel takes over for him. During this time, the state legislature approved a straightening of the West Drive for a trotter racetrack, which was kind of just like a horse racing track you can see on the right, but there is severe public backlash, and this was repealed within 6 weeks. This is really important because this is one of the first times the community actually had an opinion over the design of the park and were showing how much it mattered to them. However, moving into the 1900s, there is a decline of the park. Olmsted dies and Samuel Parsons is dismissed after disagreements with the parks commissioner over programming. After World War I, there is increased use of the park, causing deterioration, and a report of the parks is published by landscape architect Herman Merkel, calling for playgrounds along the perimeter, new paths to accommodate more visitors, and benches with durable concrete footings that will last. In the 1930s, there is a temporary revival of the park when Robert Moses, the new Parks Commissioner, is installed, and he starts a massive modernization of the city's park using the recommendations from Herman Merkel and funds from the New Deal. That's him on the right. Then there is strain from the Great Depression and World War II, leading to destruction of original structures of the park's design. There are semi-successful protests over the expansion of a restaurant called Tavern on the Green, and this is called the Battle of Central Park. It is semi-successful because they did succeed in it not turning into a parking lot. The landscape is lost, but a playground is put there instead. Robert Moses retires at this time, and Central Park is declared a National Historic Landmark by the U.S. Department of the Interior, leading to the park being increasingly used for large-scale events like concerts, festivals, and protests. In the 1970s, the city was experiencing severe fiscal crisis, causing layoffs and budget cuts, and Central Park is declared New York City's first scenic landmark. Funds are established by members of the public to address the park's condition with restorations projects. Again, the public is getting involved in the park. And a study of Central Park is released, blaming a lack of planning, supervision, accountability for adequate maintenance of the park, recommending it have a chief executive officer and board of guardians for the park. At this time, the first park administrator is appointed, having authority to consolidate all planning, management, and integrity coordination pertinent to Central Park under one singular office. So in the 1980s, this accumulates to the Central Park Task Force and Central Park Community Fund to join and form the Central Park Conservancy. They start recruiting interns for horticulture, preservation, restoration, and fundraising tasks using past park-wide studies to guide restoration and management. In the 1990s, the Conservancy started to raise funds to make up for what the city budget cuts and starts providing general maintenance that had been provided by the city initially. The Conservancy opened a visitor center and implemented a zone management system of accountability for daily maintenance of the individual landscapes. By the end of the 90s, the park's major landscapes are restored by the Central Park Conservancy, and the Parks Department signs an agreement to formalize the Conservancy's role as the official keeper of the park. And this takes us to today-ish. So now today, the Conservancy works as the sole keeper of Central Park, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in fundraising, new playgrounds, landscapes, events, planning documents, and education about the park. The park now receives 37 to 38 million visits annually. So that was the history, but I was interested in what's going on right now. And I went there to find out. Let me tell you, there were a lot of people. There were walking tours, people working out, tourists, vendors, horses, art, music, Conservancy members, boat rides, restaurants. The original Manhattan schist is still there. That was that rocky swampland in the park. There's a gift shop, even a zoo. The park is doing very good, but why? Well, we looked back on our history a bit, which explains a lot of the reasons of how the park got its stability. But I have comprised a couple things that I think really stood out that would make a design successful. So what makes a design successful? Purpose and function. So it needs to be usable, whether this is public transportation, public art spaces, sports spaces, event spaces, community gathering spaces, shops, tourist activities, or just exposure to nature. People need to want to use the landscape you design. Then it needs to connect with the public. There could be public art, events, shops, performances, activities, and more. Here's me boating all the way in the right. That was part of how you could interact with the park. It was really fun. I recommend it if you go. Your design needs to symbiotically benefit the city and the park. The design needs to adapt with the location, be receptive of public feedback, and then implement it. Public patronage. Once connected to public, you need the public support. Call to the public with signage around the park, like seen on the left. There was a lot of it in Central Park. Integrate donations and fundraising using public displays, events, merchants, tours, and gift shops. There is an Adopt-A-Bench program in Central Park where you can spend between $7,000 and $25,000 depending on the level of bench you want, and the Conservancy will maintain that bench forever. They promise. The benches tell stories of loss, declarations of love, friendship, and memories of loved ones. Reading these plaques is really like people watching in New York, and it really integrates you into the history of the space while preserving it for future. The design needs to be people-run for the people, by the people. This connection builds an admiration for the landscape, preserving it while integrating it into the community. Even if the design is successful today, it needs to be successful 200 years from now to last. It needs to have the ability to adapt. Look at Central Park. The landscape has changed, the background has changed, and the usage has changed. The park is still evolving, and new design details are constantly being added. A successful design needs room to grow and needs to stay relevant. The design needs to stay living and flexible so that it can adapt to changing needs of the space and the people. Preservation and restoration. As a designer, you want things to adapt but also stay true to your vision and goals. You did design the space. So there needs to be preservation and restoration. Maintenance is needed and things do not last without care. Make things people want to preserve and cherish by focusing on the heart of the space. The Bethesda Terrace is just as loved and used today as it was hundreds of years ago. As you can see, the tiles on the ceiling are very well preserved. Most of them are original. There were a few replicated and replaced this year that got finished up for the whole renovation, and it is a gorgeous space still. Ecological survival. Of course, it's a landscape, so it needs to focus on ecological survival. Your design needs to support a healthy ecological site that will flourish through time. These are a couple of the little critters I saw in Central Park and the landscape there. It's kind of dark, but that man was actually holding a squirrel. People are getting really into the landscape, and there's still nature there, even in New York, in the middle of this huge city. You need to give space for nature to do its thing. When you give it the right spaces, it will fill in the gaps and find a way, even in New York. This also leaves room for growth, error, and future landscaping. These flowers were a prairie restoration project that's going on right now, so obviously that wasn't Olmsted's intentional design, but there was still space for it there, and it is very beautiful. Lastly, but not least, financial security and protection. Your design needs to have financial stability through private and public resources. Central Park was not secured until the Conservancy was in place. It needs a guardian independent from fluctuating governments, and it needs financial backing from private sources that are constant and stable. Here at the end, we're almost there. There's some key pictures and takeaways I just want to go over one more time. So that was kind of some Central Park experiences, but overall, I think a design needs to have financial stability and protection through private and public resources. The design needs to adapt to the location and implement public feedback, and the design must become part of the community and be run for the people and by the people. Lastly, here are some sketches I did while I was in the park, and I outlined in a little red marker everywhere I walked on this map. I really underestimated how big the park was until I got there. So it was an amazing experience though, walking around, and I was just very thankful to take this trip. So thank you guys so much for having me.
Hello everyone, I'm Rachel Schmitmeyer. I recently graduated with my master's in architecture. I'm currently working at an architecture firm in Sydney, Ohio, but in a few months I will be taking a short little break from there to go volunteer with a nonprofit architecture firm called Engineering Ministries International. If any of the students here are interested in learning more, I would love to talk to you afterwards about it. I'd like to first thank the Columbus Foundation and the Knowlton School. Without your generosity and support, this trip would not have been possible. So this summer, I spent 3 weeks traveling across the country, visiting Boston, New Orleans, and Santa Fe, researching the relationship between power and architecture throughout the United States, and the role architecture plays in influencing our memories. This was a way to study the different regions in the United States, each with its own history and culture, exploring topics such as colonization and the Revolution, slavery and plantations, the treatment of Native American architecture and settlements, the cultures of British, French, and Spanish colonization mixed with Black and Native peoples has led to long and complex histories for each city, as well as various ways of acknowledging and teaching the past. Unfortunately, I cannot share everything I saw in 3 weeks in these 10 minutes, but I want to share a few important examples of how architecture is being used to influence our collective memories. As a nation, we are currently struggling with how to acknowledge our past, as is evident by the debate over the removal of a statue of a Spanish conquistador and with the preservation of plantations in the South. However, these challenges are not new. Following the Revolution, Bostonians rebuilt the facade of King's Chapel, which was built by British officers as a way of reclaiming the chapel. You can see the line of columns that exists in the current church was the wall, the original exterior walls. So after the Bostonians built the new exterior walls and tore out the original, the British actually took the wood from the original facade and brought it to Nova Scotia to build a new chapel there. So this kind of shows the debate and the work that each side was doing to kind of claim authority over the space and over the materials. Today, they have placed informational signs throughout the church regarding the influence parishioners of King's Chapel had on slavery, as well as other historical information. So while it is still an operational church, the congregation is using the building's historical significance to give it a secondary purpose as a museum. Another historical example of those in power repurposing architecture is the Palace of the Governors, which was constructed in 1610 by the Spanish to serve as an administrative building. Throughout its history, it has been controlled by Native Americans, Mexicans, and the US. Today, it is part of the Museum of New Mexico and is the oldest building in the continental US to be in continuous public use. From government office to home to museum, the program and style of the building has changed throughout history as those in power have changed. In 1909, it was renovated to reflect local cultures and building traditions and has influenced the adobe architecture in the rest of Santa Fe. Today, the building is a National Historic Landmark and recognized as a national treasure. A more recent example of this is the Whitney Plantation. While most plantations focus on the charms of antebellum life and gloss over the horrors of slavery, the Whitney Plantation has been transformed into the nation's first museum dedicated to slavery. It opened to the public in 2014, and in contrast to other plantations, very little attention is given to the big house. Visitors are permitted to walk through a short passage of it from the front to the back and then continue on the rest of the tour. Much of the grounds has been dedicated to memorials. The Wall of Honor in the top left corner shares the stories of over 350 individuals who were enslaved on the plantation. The Field of Angels is a memorial to all the children who died on this plantation and all plantations in Louisiana. And this final sculpture in the bottom right corner honors the lives that were taken following the slave revolt. Lastly is a memorial which lists the names of over 107,000 people who were enslaved in Louisiana. The white marble carries an architectural significance. It is a symbol of power, of wealth, is often associated with ancient civilizations and governments. It is strong, it endures over time, and it was purposely chosen to bear the names of those who were enslaved here, giving them a place in our memories for thousands of years, granting them the dignity often reserved for only those in power. The black marble was chosen because of its reflectivity. It directs visitors inwards, and I experienced this firsthand in a very powerful way. The first wall that I walked up to, the first name that I happened to read was my own. Seeing my name reflected in this marble made these stories so much more personal in a way no other experience could. Memorials can be found in abundance in Boston, although I must say they are much less moving. Walking around the Boston Commons and Boston Public Gardens and down Commonwealth Avenue feels like a never-ending line of monuments and memorials. The overwhelming number discourages people from stopping to read about each and every one, unless, of course, you are there to study the influence of architecture on memory, but I must admit that I even got tired of it after a while. You will notice on this statue a blue and yellow ribbon tied onto the monument's arms. Here again, we see the monument taking on a secondary purpose. It is now a symbol of support towards the people of Ukraine. Another aspect of Boston's abundant memorials is that they don't all receive the same amount of recognition. If you Google things to do in Boston, you'll find dozens of tours for the Freedom Trail, but nothing even mentioning the Black Heritage Trail. The Freedom Trail is delineated by a brick line that runs through the sidewalks and streets of the city, and each stop is marked by a nice paver in the ground. Most of them also have a large informational plaque. You can see here. While walking the Black Heritage Trail, I saw 2 of these signs indicating the trail, and less than half of the buildings had a small plaque, and the ones that did, you often had a surcharge for. For most of the trail, I was relying on the images on the back of my map to determine what building I was even supposed to be looking at. This statue of Abraham Lincoln and an unnamed black man in Boston is a replica of one in DC, which was commissioned by a black community to honor the Emancipation Proclamation. While some may argue that the black man is rising up from the chains of bondage, many others see Abraham Lincoln standing proud while a shirtless black man kneels at his feet. Because of this, the statue has been taken down and is placed in storage while the city decides what the best option going forward is. Should the statue be returned to its original location and a sign added? Should it be placed in a museum where more context can be given? In Santa Fe, some of the pueblos surrounding the city were abandoned by Native people who were forced to leave due to war, disease, or various other reasons. These historic sites have been named national monuments, giving them national funding and protection. Today, descendants of these pueblos return on important feast days for traditional celebrations. However, sometimes this national recognition can lead to challenges. In 2020, the city of Santa Fe formed a committee to evaluate all of the city's statues and monuments. Currently, 3 controversial monuments have been or are being removed. This was the location of a statue of Conquistador Don Diego de Vargas. The statue has been removed, and in its place sits a nice flower pot. An obelisk in Santa Fe Plaza, which honors the Civil War heroes who died in battle against savage Indians. This inscription was removed from the monument in the 1970s. At that time, the city council had unanimously voted to remove the obelisk. However, they later learned that the monument is a National Historic Landmark and cannot be removed with the risk of losing federal money. So they are currently taking legal action at the state and national level. Following a protest in 2020, during which protesters tore down the obelisk, the city boarded up the remainder of the monument and placed this sign in front of it as the community works to determine the next steps. This is also the case for the Kit Carson obelisk, which sits in front of the state courthouse on ground that is part of a National Register of Historic Places. In 1974, calls began for the removal of a statue in New Orleans, which commemorates an insurrection led by the Crescent City White League against the Reconstruction-era Louisiana state government. The debate continued in various ways for years, and in 1990, John H. Wilson III and others filed for National Historic status to protect the monument from being torn down. In a letter from Wilson to the City Council, dated July 26, 1990, he said, "Consider the monument as an urban design element, and do not engage in its historical or social debate about its merits." Wilson is trying to cover up the historical and social meanings associated with the monument, but the original intent behind the monument cannot be easily reframed. National Historic status was granted. However, the monument was moved to a much less prominent spot next to this lovely parking garage, and then in 2017 was removed. And I will say, I had to search long and hard to find this spot, which the city cleverly tucked away. So even though the statue is no longer there, records survive. So is it better to destroy the architectural evidence in the hope of erasing the memory, or to repurpose it and recognize the mistakes of the past in the hopes of learning from it for the future? While this monument has been more thoroughly erased, at least architecturally, for better or for worse, some controversial monuments still have a mark on the city. These indicate a shift in the mindsets of citizens and people in positions of power. What was once honored is no longer valued. The architectural remains remind us of the change that has happened. I will leave you with this more pleasant image. In the words of Nancy Schoen, who was the creator of the sculpture Make Way for Ducklings, "There is a unique connection between the people of Boston and these sculptures that brings people together. These outfits reveal the lasting power of public art and how viewers can also be participants." So civilizations and time periods are often remembered by their architecture. When power shifts, those who come into power often decide what gets destroyed, repurposed, or memorialized. As architects, landscape architects, and planners, our designs will influence people's lives for generations to come. Architecture has power. How do you want your work to influence our collective memory? Thank you.